Hey everyone, and welcome to the Library Socialist Book Club live stream. This is a reading of the 5th chapter of Post-Scarcity Anarchism by Murray Bookchin. Just making some last-minute adjustments on the size of the window here because I'm an amateur. So people watching the video right now can see that we're patching through some video from a Microsoft Edge tab, which I wouldn't usually use, but it opened the PDF. So we've got with us today a number of book club members and readers, and we're going to go through the text and just do sort of a reading page by page, handing it off to one another. And then after each heading, we'll have a little bit of brief discussion. But the majority of the discussion that we do on the text, and that you're all welcome to join us in, is on the Wednesday meetings, which are not recorded in the Seriously Wrong Discord. So everyone's welcome to join the Seriously Wrong Book Club, the library, or everyone's welcome to join the Library Socialist Book Club. If you need access to the Discord server, just shoot us a message and we'll get you a link so you can join. We don't want money to be a barrier to anyone, especially right now. And if you haven't watched this sort of thing before, and you're watching it later in the future, sometimes there's little hiccups with live stuff. I like to listen to live stuff at like 1.25 speed personally, but you can find your own sort of mix on that of what works for you. Do we want to just go down the list of people who are here today and just say hey and introduce yourself if you'd like, and then I'll get started on reading the start here. So first, I'm Sean. Yeah, looking forward to this.
I'm Alicia, and I enjoy reading out loud, so I am here at your service. Enmas is watching our volume on the live stream, so maybe he's not gonna do his intro.
We also have. Oh, yeah. Go for it, H.
Yeah, I'm Harrison. I'm just happy to be here and involved with such a fun little group we have.
Hi, and I'm James. And doing this for the last couple of weeks, and I'm really enjoying it. Tonight should be a fantastic one. Can't wait.
Hi, I'm Rosa. I missed last week and I'll be back.
Hi, I'm Morgan. This one looks like it's going to be a hoot.
I am Sen on Discord, and I really love reading for you guys, and I love reading Bookchin, and I love this group. It's a really fun group.
Well, that's awesome. I really like doing this too. It's really fun. And so everyone, I want to emphasize again, if you're watching this, feel free to reach out to get an invite to the Discord server to get involved in the reading group. We do live readings of the text every Thursday, and then we do two discussions on that text the following Wednesday. So you can check the times. There's a link to the Sunflower Wiki in the description of the YouTube video. It's got also all of the previous streams we've done, hiccups and all, but a lot of great stuff in there. And it's also got the most up-to-date times of when on Wednesdays we meet. There's two different times. You can pick whichever time zone works for you. And then on Thursdays, we do the reading of the next week. So everyone has a week to listen in if they want to listen rather than read it themselves, because we want to try to help make this stuff as accessible as possible. So the chapter that we are reading today is Listen, Marxist. It's chapter 5 of the book, and it's a polemic that Murray Bookchin wrote in his time when he left after a lifetime of being a Marxist revolutionary. He decided basically that it wasn't for him, and he chose the path of anarchism, and specifically social anarchism instead. We won't get into this today, but later in his life he also ended up rejecting anarchism. It's an interesting story, but irrelevant to this text specifically, except to say that people's ideas change over time, and this essay isn't fully reflective of the totality of Bookchin's ideas, but it's certainly a really, really great picture into a certain mindset that he had at a certain time in his development. All the old crap of the 30s is coming back again. The shit about the class line, the role of the working class, the trained cadres, the vanguard party, and the proletarian dictatorship. It's all back again in a more vulgarized form than ever. The Progressive Labor Party is not the only example, it is merely the worst. One smells the same shit in various offshoots of SDS and in the Marxist and socialist clubs on campuses, not to speak of the Trotskyist groups, the international socialist clubs, and the Youth Against War and Fascism. In the 30s, at least, it was understandable. The United States was paralyzed by a chronic economic crisis, the deepest and longest in history. The only living forces that seemed to be battering at the walls of capitalism were the great organizing drives of the CIO, with their dramatic sit-down strikes, their radical militancy, and their bloody clashes with the police. The political atmosphere throughout the entire world was charged by the electricity of the Spanish Civil War, the last of the classical workers' revolutions, when every radical sect in the American left could identify with its own militia columns in Madrid and Barcelona. That was 30 years ago. It was a time when anyone who cried out, "Make love, not war," would have been regarded as a freak. The cry then was "make jobs, not war," the cry of an age burdened by scarcity, when the achievement of socialism entailed sacrifices, quote, sacrifices, and a, quote, transition period to an economy of material abundance. To an 18-year-old kid in 1937, the very concept of cybernation would have seemed like the wildest science fiction, a fantasy comparable to visions of space travel. You want to pick it up, Alicia?
Sorry, that sounds like it might be my cue, maybe?
Yeah.
That 18-year-old kid has now reached 50 years of age, and his roots are planted in an era so remote as to differ qualitatively from the realities of the present period in the United States. Capitalism itself has changed since then, taking on increasingly stratified forms that could be anticipated only dimly 30 years ago. And now we are being asked to go back to the quote class line, the quote strategies, the quote cadre, I can only say that in French, cadres, and the organizational forms of that distant period in almost blatant disregard of the new issues and possibilities that have emerged. When the hell are we finally going to create a movement that looks to the future instead of the past? When will we begin to learn from what is being born instead of what is dying? Marx, to his lasting credit, tried to do that in his own day. He tried to evoke a futuristic spirit in the revolutionary movement of the 1840s and 1850s. Quote here, "The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living," he wrote in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And just when they seem to be engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating something entirely new, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrow from them names, battle slogans, and costumes in order to present the new scene of world history in this time-honored disguise and borrowed language. Thus, Luther donned the mask of the Apostle Paul. The revolution of 1789 to 1814 draped itself alternately as the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and the revolution of 1848 knew nothing better than to parody, in turn, 1789 and the tradition of 1793 to 1795. The social revolution of the 19th century cannot draw its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has stripped off all superstition in regard to the past. In order to arrive at its content, the revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury their dead. There the phrase went beyond the content. Here, the content goes beyond the phrase. And that's the end of the Marx quote, and I'll pass that on to the next reader.
Is the problem any different today as we approach the 21st century? Once again, the dead are walking in our midst, ironically draped in the name of Marx, the man who tried to bury the dead of the 19th century. So the revolution of our own day can do nothing better than parody. In turn, the October Revolution of 1917 and the Civil War of 1918-1920, with its class line, its Bolshevik Party, its proletarian dictatorship, its puritanical morality, and even its slogan, Soviet power. The complete all-sided revolution of our own day that can finally resolve the historic social question, born of scarcity, dominion, and hierarchy, follows the tradition of partial, the incomplete, the one-sided revolutions of the past, which merely changed from the social question, replacing one system of domination and hierarchy by another. At the time when the bourgeois society itself, in the process of disintegrating all the social classes that once gave its stability, we hear the hollow demands for a class line. At a time when all the political institutions of hierarchical society are entertaining a period of profound decay, we hear the hollow demands for a political party and a workers' state. At a time when hierarchy as such is being brought into the question, we hear the hollow demands for cadres, vanguards, and leaders. At a time when centralization and the state have been brought to the most explosive point in historical negativity, we hear the hollow demands for a centralized movement and a proletarian dictatorship. The pursuit of security in the past, this attempt to find a haven in a fixed dogma and organizational hierarchy as substitutes for creative thought and praxis, is bitter evidence of how little many revolutionaries are capable of revolutionizing themselves and things, much less of revolutionizing society as a whole. The deep-rooted, scrolling, conservative of the PLP revolutionaries is almost painfully evident as the authoritarian leader of hierarchy replaced the patriarchs and the social bureaucracy. The discipline of the movement replaces the discipline of bourgeois society. The authoritarian code of political obedience replaces the state. The credo of proletarian mortality replaces mores of Puritanism and the work ethic. The substance of exploitive society reappears in new forms, draped in a red flag, decorated by portraits of Mao or Castro or Che. Sean, what are you doing to me? And adorned with the little red book and other sacred litanies. Does someone else want to take the reins here?
The majority of the people who remain in the PLP today deserve it. If they can live with a movement that cynically dubs its own slogans into photographs of drum pickets, if they can read a magazine that asks whether Marcuse is a cop-out or a cop, if they can accept a discipline that reduces them to poker-faced, programmed automata, if they can use the most disgusting techniques borrowed from the cesspool of bourgeois business operations and parliamentarianism, to manipulate other organizations, if they can parasitize virtually every action and situation merely to promote the growth of their party, even if this means defeat for the action itself, then they are beneath contempt. For these people to call themselves Reds and describe attacks upon them as red baiting is a form of McCarthyism in reverse. To rephrase Trotsky's juicy description of Stalinism, they are the syphilis of radical youth movement today, and for syphilis there is only one treatment, an antibiotic, not an argument. Our concern here is with those honest revolutionaries who have turned to Marxism, Leninism, or Trotskyism because they earnestly seek a coherent social outlook and an effective strategy of revolution. We are also concerned with those who are awed by the theoretical repertory of Marxist ideology and are disposed to flirt with it in the absence of more systematic alternatives. To these people, we address ourselves as brothers and sisters and ask for a serious discussion and a comprehensive reevaluation. We believe that Marxism has ceased to be applicable to our time not because it is too visionary or revolutionary, but because it is not visionary or revolutionary enough. We believe that it was born in an era of scarcity and presented a brilliant critique of that era, specifically of the industrial capitalism, and that a new era is in birth which Marxism does not adequately encompass and whose outlines it only partially and one-sidedly anticipated. We argue that the problem is not to abandon Marxism or to annul it, but to transcend it dialectically, just as Marx transcended Hegelian philosophy, Ricardian economics, and Blanquist tactics and modes of organization. We shall argue that in a more advanced stage of capitalism than Marx dealt with a century ago, and in a more advanced stage of technological development than Marx could have clearly anticipated, a new critique is necessary, which in turn yields new modes of struggle, of organization, of propaganda, and of lifestyle. Call these new modes whatever you will, even Marxism if you wish. We have chosen to call this new approach post-scarcity anarchism for a number of compelling reasons which will become evident in the pages that follow.
So here we can pick up, before we move on to the next section, and I'll open up the floor to discussion.
Can somebody tell me what is the PLP?
So the PLP
was Progressive Labour Party.
Everybody say it all at the same time.
So yeah, it was the Progressive Labour Party, and he talks a little bit more about it in one of the footnotes there at the time. I guess they had a deal of influence within the Students for a Democratic Society. I don't know the specific reference in detail, but I think this is a perfect place. So we'll have a link in the reading notes to the Progressive Labour Party, among other things like we do from all these discussions. But yeah, I think this is a good place because there's a title here before we move on to the next thing to sort of open up the floor for discussion if anyone has thoughts on what we've read so far. First, I'll just say in purely poetic terms, I have such an affinity for the way that he uses the dead will bury their dead metaphor and then contrasting Marx with Marxists. In this context, I just feel like it's a very powerful rhetorical strategy that he takes, and it's very poetic, the sort of idea of, Marx wanted people to bury their dead, but ironically we're still speaking through his corpse.
I suppose at the time that he's writing as well, obviously he's writing in the mid-60s. The dead burying their dead thing is a lot more poignant because for most of his initial audience, the Spanish Civil War is still in living memory. He even says, doesn't he? Oh, that was 30 years ago. But, of course, people who were reading his texts, well, some of them would have definitely been around and maybe even known people who had fought in Spain on the anarchist side. So it's very poignant metaphor there.
Also, I feel like maybe it's worth saying that this is a very spicy take from Murray Bookchin. That at the time, I think both at the time and in the current context, like I can imagine people finding this polemical style an attack on taking this sort of thing as an attack on what they hold dear to them. Someone had already tweeted actually at us about doing this reading that they thought this was Bookchin's worst work, and I'm presuming that they're a Marxist. But I think he's got worse than this. And but there's things that I really, really like about this, and there's something so beautiful about like a really strong polemic. I really appreciate it. So I'll just give a chance once again if anyone else wants to hop in. Otherwise, we can pick up where we were reading and move on from here.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to continue with the next section, which is entitled "The Historical Limits of Marxism." The idea that a man whose greatest theoretical contributions were made between 1840 and 1880 could, quote, foresee the entire dialectic of capitalism is, on the face of it, utterly preposterous. If we can still learn much from Marx's insights, we can learn even more from the unavoidable errors of a man who was limited by an era of material scarcity, a technology that barely involved the use of electric power. We can learn how different our era is from that of all past history, how qualitatively new are the potentialities that confront us, how unique are the issues, analyses, and praxis that stand before us. We are to make a revolution, not another historical abortion. The problem is not that Marxism is a method which must be reapplied to, quote, new situations, or that, quote, neo-Marxism has to be developed to overcome the limitations of, quote, classical Marxism. The attempt to rescue the Marxian pedigree by emphasizing the method over the system, or by adding neo to a sacred word, is sheer mystification if all the practical conclusions of the system flatly contradict these efforts. Bookchin now proceeds into a lengthy footnote, which I'll read from now. Marxism is above all a theory of praxis, or to place this relationship in its correct perspective, a praxis of theory. This is the very meaning of Marx's transformation of dialectics, which took from the subjective dimension, to which the young Hegelians still try to confine Hegel's outlook, into the objective, from philosophical critique into social action. If theory and praxis become divorced, Marxism is not killed, it commits suicide. This is its most admirable and noble feature. The attempts of the cretins who follow in Marx's wake keep the system alive with a patchwork of emendations, exegesis, and half-assed, quote, scholarship, unquote, a la Maurice Dobb and George Novak, are degrading insults to Marx's name and the disgusting pollution of everything he stood for. Bookchin returns from that saucy diatribe to the main text, which I continue now. Yet this is precisely the state of affairs in Marxian exegesis today. Marxists lean on the fact that the system provides a brilliant interpretation of the past while willfully ignoring its utterly misleading features in dealing with the present and future. They cite the coherence that historical materialism and the class analysis give to the interpretation of history, the economic insights of capital, provides into the development of industrial capitalism and the brilliance of Marx's analysis of earlier revolutions and the tactical conclusions he established, without once recognizing that qualitatively new problems have arisen which never existed in his day. I've reached the end of the page, so I'm going to hand over to Mwed now, if you're ready. I think you might be on mute, Mwed. Can't hear you. Okay, we're having some difficulties hearing Mwed and Rosa. Can you hear me?
Our next two, I can hear you still, James. Our next two speakers have both had issues with their mics and / Discord at the same time. I could hear you, but you sounded a little bit like a robot that time. It was a little bit beepy boopy.
Oh yeah, feel free to skip me. We'll skip it.
Yeah, Rosie, you're really grainy at the moment. Can't hear you.
Maybe we can hop down to the bottom of the list there if you're ready, Sin, to pick up, and then we can fix the mic issues and loop back around.
Okay. I think we're on page 201? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh yeah, we can hear you, Sin. And we're just. I finished the first sentence of 201. So you want to start with "It is conceivable."
Okay. Is it conceivable that historical problems and methods of class analysis based entirely on unavoidable scarcity can be transplanted into a new era of potential abundance? Is it conceivable that an economic analysis focused primarily on freely competitive system of industrial capitalism can be transferred to a managed system of capitalism where state and monopolies combine to manipulate economic life? Is it conceivable that a strategic and tactical repertory formulated in a period when coal and steel constituted the basis of industrial technology can be transferred to an age based on radically new sources of energy, on electronics, on cybernation? As a result of this transfer, a theoretical corpus which was liberating a century ago is turned into a straitjacket today. We are asked to focus on the working class as the agent of evolutionary change at a time when capitalism visibly antagonizes and produces revolutionaries among virtually all strata of society, particularly the young. We are asked to guide our tactical methods by the vision of a chronic economic crisis, despite the fact that no such crisis has been in the offing for 30 years. He has a footnote. In fact, Marxists do very little talking about the chronic economic crisis of capitalism these days, despite the fact that this concept forms the focal point of Marx's economic theories. Back to the reading. We are asked to accept a proletarian dictatorship, a long transitional period, whose function is not merely the suppression of counter-revolutionaries, but above all the development of a technology of abundance, at a time when a technology of abundance is at hand. I feel like, yeah, he did say that. We are asked to orient our strategies and tactics around poverty and material immersion at a time when revolutionary sentiment is being generated by the banality of life under conditions of material abundance. We are asked to establish political parties, centralized organizations, revolutionary hierarchies, and elites, and a new state at a time when political institutions as such are decaying and when centralization, elitism, and the state are being brought into question on a scale that has never occurred before in the history of hierarchical society.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. We are asked, in short, to return to the past, to diminish instead of grow, to force the throbbing reality of our times, with its hopes and promises, into the deadening preconceptions of an outlived age. We are asked to operate with principles that have been transcended not only theoretically, but by the very development of society itself. History has not stood still since Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky died. Nor has it followed the simplistic direction which was charted out by thinkers, however brilliant, whose minds were still rooted in the 19th century or in the opening years of the 20th. We have seen capitalism itself perform many of the tasks, including the development of a technology of abundance, which were regarded as socialist. We have seen it nationalize property, merging the economy with the state wherever necessary. We have seen the working class neutralized as the, quote, agent of revolutionary change, albeit still struggling within a bourgeois framework for more wages, shorter hours, and fringe benefits. The class struggle in the classical sense has not disappeared. It has suffered a more deadening fate by being co-opted into capitalism. The revolutionary struggle within the advanced capitalist countries has shifted to a historically new terrain. It has become a struggle between a generation of youth that has known no chronic economic crisis and the culture, values, and institutions of an older conservative generation whose perspective on life has been shaped by scarcity, guilt, renunciation, the work ethic, and the pursuit of material security. Our enemies are not only the visibly entrenched bourgeoisie and the state apparatus, but also an outlook which finds its support among liberals, social democrats, the minions of a corrupt mass media, the revolutionary parties of the past, and, painful as it may be, to the acolytes of Marxism, the worker dominated by the factory hierarchy, by the industrial routine, and by the work ethic. The point is that the divisions now cut across virtually all the traditional class lines, and they raise a spectrum of problems that none of the Marxists leaning on analogies with scarcity societies could foresee. And I think we're going to pause here for a conversation.
Yeah. Do you want to take here? Harrison can go first.
Yeah, I just really quickly, particularly because he's talking about this, especially throughout this chapter, especially the idea that we have reached a point, and we had reached a point for a very long time, as both Marx and Kropotkin point out, where abundance was eminently achievable. It was pretty much possible to feed everyone on the planet and to house everyone. It's been that way since pretty much the 1880s. But I think there's the idea that given the possibility that there is this possibility for abundance and this possibility including distribution, but I think there's also a possibility that through different ecological disasters or failure to act rationally in society, society-wise, not individually, we may also return to a point where scarcity is an issue, and I question obviously this is not necessarily Bookchin's point that the rational choice is the inevitable choice, but I wonder if it is possible what liberatory structures would be useful in the event that the scarcity route is what ends up happening, and what can we sustain in that state.
Something from this chapter that I wanted to sort of briefly comment on in the writing here, in the way that Bookchin frames it, which I think is interesting, when he's talking about, like taking cues from what's being born instead of what's dying and stuff like that, I find these metaphors like very, very potent. And it connects to my earlier comment as well. In just that the way that he, in this chapter, sort of like, and I've heard people make these sort of arguments before, but there's the way that he lays it out is actually, like, I think very strong, in that he just sort of systematically, like, the idea that Marx could have some sort of like total understanding of the current system based on his context. Now, I don't think many people would actually claim that in the modern day, but I think that there are people who do fit in these sort of outlier categories, and this polemic was actually sort of part of the development of the common sense on the left, including development of common sense within, I think, some Marxist circles, which did work to integrate critiques that were being brought forward by Bookchin and people like him. So, yeah, I wanted to comment on that. And for the question of, like, how do we go, what do we do in the instance of scarcity, although the absence of scarcity is possible, I think there's, what comes to mind for me is, like, we can work outward from a sort of like a set of ethical principles on how to best distribute things. But often I think the capacity for overcoming scarcity is with us. Like, there's very, very rare situations where there's actually like a true and deep scarcity, only one medicine, two people who need it, like with no distortions on top of that. So I like, because I don't know, there's always potentials of, like, say, finding ways to reach that sort of post-scarcity level, if not in a technological sense, in a use case sense, that everyone has all the food they need. Everyone has all, it's not that they have unlimited of any food anytime, but they have all the food they need. So even under conditions of scarcity, we can achieve sort of that experience of post-scarcity, at least to a certain degree, is something that come to mind. So I'll pass off the floor now.
That's a great point, Sean. And specifically here, I mean, it's a theme that's run through the last couple of chapters, actually, isn't it? That the conditions that were appropriate for 19th century socialism of various different types are just completely obsolete, even by the 1960s. And there's this really resonant metaphor that he gets into here of actually trying to force the present into the past. This kind of backwards looking traditionalism within the left, and that's super resonant for today's organizing context as well, right? Like, something that is always really inspiring to see as a forward-facing response to capitalism, rather than a backwards-facing one that's trying to reconstruct and cobble together these pieces of like an ancient past, trying to resurrect movements that were developed for circumstances that no longer exist. It's very interesting.
Since we don't have anyone on Stack, and our friend here, Porgum, is going to have to run, maybe I'll hand off to them to pick up from the myth of the proletariat.
Thank you. Cool. The myth of the proletariat. Let us cast aside all the ideological debris of the past and cut to the theoretical roots of the problem. For our age, Marx's greatest contribution to revolutionary thought is his dialectic of social development. Marx laid bare the great movement from primitive communism through private property to communism in its higher form, a communal society resting on a liberatory technology. In this movement, according to Marx, man passes on from the domination of man by nature to the domination of man by man, and finally to the domination of nature by man. It's a little footnote. For ecological reasons, we do not accept the notion of the domination of nature by man in this simplistic sense that was passed on by Marx a century ago. For a discussion of this problem, see Ecology and Revolutionary Thought. finally to the dominion of nature by man, and from social domination as such. Within this larger dialectic, Marx examines the dialectic of capitalism itself, a social system which constitutes the last historical stage in the domination of man by man. Here, Marx makes not only profound contributions to contemporary revolutionary thought, particularly in his brilliant analysis of the commodity relationship, but also exhibits those limitations of time and place that play so confining a role in our own time. The most serious of these limitations emerges from Marx's attempt to explain the transition from capitalism to socialism, from a class society to a classless society. It is vitally important to emphasize that this explanation was reasoned out almost entirely by analogy with the transition of feudalism to capitalism. That is, from one class society to another class society, from one system of property to another. Accordingly, Marx points out that just as the bourgeoisie developed within feudalism as a result of the split between town and country, more precisely between crafts and agriculture, so the modern proletariat developed within capitalism as a result of the advance of industrial technology. Both classes, we are told, developed social interests of their own, indeed revolutionary social interests that throw them against the old society which they were. If the bourgeoisie gained control over economic life long before it overthrew feudal society, the proletariat in turn gains its own revolutionary power by the fact that it is disciplined, united, organized by the factory system. Another big footnote there. It is ironic that Marxists who talk about the economic power of the proletariat are actually echoing the position of the anarcho-syndicalists, a position that Marx bitterly opposed. Marx was not concerned with the economic power of the proletariat, but with its political power, notably the fact that it would become the majority of the population. He was convinced that the industrial workers would be driven to revolution primarily by material destitution, which would follow from the tendency of capitalist accumulation, that organized by the factory system and disciplined by industrial routine, they would be able to constitute trade unions, and above all, political parties, which in some countries would be obliged to use insurrectionary methods, and in others, England, the United States, and in later years, Engels added France, might well come to power in elections and legislate socialism into existence. Characteristically, many Marxists have been as dishonest with their Marx and Engels as the Progressive Labor Party has been with the readers of Challenge, leaving important observations untranslated or grossly distorting Marx's meaning. Okay, back to the main text. In both cases, the development of the productive forces becomes incompatible with the traditional system of social relations. The integument is burst asunder. The old society is replaced by the new.
Hi, can you hear me this?
Unfortunately, Rosa's connection is still sounding very robotic. So I'm going to pick up here, and we'll see if we can if it resolves itself. The critical question we face is this: can we explain the transition from a class society to a classless society by means of the same dialectic that accounts for the transition of one class society to another? This is not a textbook problem that involves the juggling of logical abstractions, but a very real and concrete issue for our time. There are profound differences between the development of the bourgeoisie under feudalism and the development of the proletariat under capitalism, which Marx either failed to anticipate or never faced clearly. The bourgeoisie controlled economic life long before it took state power. It had become the dominant class materially, culturally, and ideologically before it asserted its dominance politically. The proletariat does not control economic life. Despite its indispensable role in the industrial process, the industrial working class is not even a majority of the population, and its strategic economic position is being eroded by cybernation and other technological advances. And here's a footnote. This is as good a place as any to dispose of the notion that anyone is a proletarian who has nothing to sell but his labor power. It is true that Marx defined the proletariat in these terms, but he also worked out a historical dialectic in the development of the proletariat. The proletariat developed out of a propertyless, exploited class, reaching its most advanced form in the industrial proletariat, which corresponded to the most advanced form of capital. In the later years of his life, Marx came to despise the Parisian workers, who were engaged preponderantly in the production of luxury goods, citing our German workers, the most robot-like in Europe, as the model proletariat of the world. Hence, it requires an act of high consciousness for the proletariat to use its power to achieve a social revolution. Until now, the achievement of this consciousness has been blocked by the fact that the factory milieu is one of the most well-entrenched arenas of the work ethic, of hierarchical systems of management, of obedience to leaders, and in recent times of production committed to superfluous commodities and armaments. The factory serves not only to discipline, unite, and organize the workers, but also to do so in a thoroughly bourgeois fashion. In the factory, capitalist production not only renews the social relations of capitalism with each working day, as Marx observed, it also renews the psyche, values, and ideology of capitalism. We can pass off to...
I'm going to give this one last try.
Hey,
Is this working this time?
Yes.
Yes! It was the headphones. These are different headphones. Excellent. I'm very excited. All right. May I take up the reading?
Yeah, you can pick up from the...
Marx sensed, right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Marx sensed this fact sufficiently to look for reasons more compelling than the mere fact of exploitation or conflicts over wages, and hours to propel over conflict and wages and hours, to propel the proletariat into revolutionary action. In his general theory of capitalist accumulation, he tried to delineate the hard, objective laws that force the proletariat to assume a revolutionary role. Accordingly, he developed his famous theory of immiseration. Competition between capitalists compels them to undercut each other's prices, which in turn leads to a continual reduction of wages and the absolute impoverishment of the workers. The proletariat is compelled to revolt because with the process of competition and the centralization of capital there grows the massive misery, oppression, and slavery degradation. But capitalism has not stood still since Marx's day. Writing in the middle years of the 19th century, Marx could not be expected to grasp the full consequences of his insights into the centralization of capital and the development of new technology. He could not be expected to foresee that capitalism would develop not only from mercantilism into the dominant industrial form of his day, from state-aided trading monopolies into highly competitive industrial units, but further, that with the centralization of capital, capitalism returns to its mercantilist origins on a higher level of development and reassumes the state-aided monopolistic form. The economy tends to merge with the state, and capitalism begins to plan its development instead of leaving it exclusively to the interplay of competition and market. To be sure, the system does not abolish the traditional class struggle, but manages to contain it using its immense technological resource to assimilate the most strategic selection of the working class. The most strategic sections of the working class. Thus, the full thrust of the immiseration theory is blunted, and in the United States, the traditional class struggle fails to develop into the class war. It remains entirely within bourgeois dimensions. Marxism, in fact, becomes ideology. It is assimilated by the most advanced forms of state capitalist movement, notably It is assimilated by the most advanced forms of state capitalism, notably Russia, by an incredible irony of history. Marxian socialism turns out to be in large the very state capitalism that Marx fails to anticipate in the dialectic of capitalism. The proletariat, instead of developing into a revolutionary class, there's actually a footnote that I don't. The proletariat, yeah. Okay. I think I'll get it for today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your reading, Rosa. That was really great. And the free auto tune at the end there was had us all dancing. But the let's see. Sorry, Rosa. Can someone type where we could pick up? I just lost track in the.
I can pick it up next.
Sweet. Yeah, if you want to take over.
Okay, I'll just do the last couple sentences of that paragraph. So we're on page 207, kind of middle of the page. It is assimilated by the most advanced forms of the state capitalist movement, notably Russia. By an incredible irony of history, Marxian socialism turns out to be in large part the very state capitalism that Marx failed to anticipate in the dialectic of capitalism. Footnote. Lenin sensed this and described socialism as, quote, nothing but state capitalist monopoly made to benefit the whole people. This is an extraordinary statement if one thinks out its implications, and a mouthful of contradictions. Back to the text. The proletariat, instead of developing into a revolutionary class within the womb of capitalism, turns out to be an organ within the body of bourgeois society. The question we must ask at this late date in history is whether a social revolution that seeks to achieve a classless society can emerge from a conflict between traditional classes in a class society, or whether such a social revolution can only emerge from the decomposition of the traditional classes. Indeed, from the emergence of an entirely new class, whose very essence is that it is a non-class. A growing stratum of revolutionaries. In trying to answer this question, we can learn more by returning to the broader dialectic which Marx developed for human society as a whole than from the model he borrowed from the passage of feudal into capitalist society. Just as primitive kinship clans began to differentiate into classes, so in our own day there is a tendency for classes to decompose into entirely new subcultures, which bear a resemblance to non-capitalist forms of relationships. These are not strictly economic groups anymore. In fact, they reflect the tendency of the social development to transcend the economic categories of scarcity society. They constitute, in effect, a crude, ambiguous, cultural preformation of the movement of scarcity into post-scarcity society. Does someone want to pick up here?
Yeah, I'll take it. Let me figure out where I am here. The process of class decomposition must be understood at all its dimensions. The word process must be emphasized here. The traditional classes do not disappear, nor for the matter does the class struggle. Only a social revolution could remove the prevailing class structure and the conflicts it engenders. The point is, the traditional class struggle ceases to have revolutionary implications. It reveals itself as the psychology of prevailing society. Physiology, sorry. Not as the labor pains of birth. In fact, the traditional class struggle stabilizes capitalist society by correcting its abuses in wages, hours, inflation, employment, etc. The unions in capitalist society can constitute themselves into a counter monopoly, monopoly in quotes here, to the industrial monopolies and are incorporated into the mercantile stratified economy as an estate. Within this estate, there are lesser or greater conflicts, but taken as a whole, the unions strengthen the system and serve to perpetuate it. To reinforce this class structure by babbling about the, quote, role of the working class, to reinforce the traditional class struggle by imputing a, quote, revolutionary content to it, to infect the new revolutionary movement of our time with workeritis, in quotes, is reactionary to the core. How often do the Marxian doctrinaries have to be reminded that the history of the class struggle is the history of a disease, of the wounds opened by the famous social question, of man's one-sided development in trying to gain control over nature by dominating his fellow man. If the byproduct of this disease has been technological advance, the main products have been repression, a horrible shedding of human blood, and terrifying distortion of the human psyche. As the disease approaches its end, as the wounds begin to heal in their deepest recesses, the process now unfolds towards wholeness. The revolutionary implications of the traditional class struggle lose their meaning and as theoretical constructs and as a social reality. The process of decomposition embraces not only traditional class structure, but also patriarchal family, authoritarian modes of upbringing, the influence of religion, the institutions of the state, and the more it builds around toil, renunciation, guilt, and repressed sexuality. The process of disintegration, in short, now becomes generalized and cuts across virtually all the traditional classes, values, and institutions. It creates entirely new issues, modes of struggle, and forms of organization, and calls for an entirely new approach in theory and praxis. What does this mean concretely? Let us contrast two approaches, the Marxian and the revolutionary. The Marxian doctrine would have us approach the worker, or better, quote, enter the factory and pro-sterilize him in preference, end quote. Preference in quotes, rather. To anyone else, the purpose, to make the worker, quote, class conscious. To cite the most Neanderthal examples from the old left, one cuts one's hair, grooms oneself in conventional sports clothing, abandons pot for cigarettes and beer, dances conventionally, affects, quote, rough mannerisms, and develops a humorless, deadpan, and pompous mien. Someone else want to take it over?
One becomes, in short, what the worker is at his most characterized worst. Not a petty bourgeois degenerate, to be sure, but a bourgeois degenerate. One becomes an imitation of the worker insofar as the worker is an imitation of his masters. Beneath this metamorphosis of the student into the, quote, worker, lies a vicious cynicism. One tries to use the discipline inculcated by the factory milieu to discipline the worker to the party milieu. One tries to use the worker's respect for the industrial hierarchy to wed the worker to the party hierarchy. This disgusting process, which, if successful, could lead only to the substitution of one hierarchy for another, is achieved by pretending to be concerned with the worker's economic day-to-day demands. Even Marxian theory is degraded to accord with this debased image of the worker. See almost any copy of Challenge, the National Enquirer of the left. Nothing bores the worker more than this kind of literature. In the end, the worker is shrewd enough to know that he will get better results in the day-to-day class struggle through his union bureaucracy than through a Marxian party bureaucracy. The 40s revealed this so dramatically that within a year or two, with hardly any protest from the rank and file, unions succeeded in kicking out by the thousands Marxians who had done spade work in the labor movement for more than a decade, even rising to the top leadership of the old CIO internationals. The worker becomes a revolutionary, not by becoming more of a worker, but by undoing his workerness. And in this he is not alone. The same applies to the farmer, the student, the clerk, the soldier, the bureaucrat, the professional, and the Marxist. The worker is no less a bourgeois than the farmer, student, clerk, soldier, bureaucrat, professional, and Marxist. His workerness is the disease he is suffering from. the social affliction telescoped to individual dimensions. Lenin understood this in What is to be Done, but he smuggled in the old hierarchy under a red flag and some revolutionary verbiage. The worker begins to become a revolutionary when he undoes his workerness, when he comes to detest his class status here and now, when he begins to shed exactly those features which the Marxists prized in him. His work ethic, his character structure derived from industrial discipline, his respect for hierarchy, his obedience to leaders, his consumerism, his vestiges of Puritanism. In this sense, the worker becomes a revolutionary to the degree that he sheds his class status and achieves an unclass consciousness. He degenerates, and he degenerates magnificently. What he is shedding are precisely those class shackles that bind him to all systems of domination. He abandons those class interests that enslave him to consumerism, suburbia, and a bookkeeping conception of life. Footnote: the worker, in this sense, begins to approximate the socially transitional human types who provided history with its most revolutionary elements. Generally, the proletariat has been most revolutionary in transitional periods, when it was least proletarianized psychically by the industrial system. The great focuses of the classical workers' revolutions were Petrograd and Barcelona, where the workers had been directly uprooted from a peasant background, and Paris, where they were still anchored in crafts or came directly from a craft background. These workers had the greatest difficulty in acclimating themselves to industrial domination and became a continual source of social and revolutionary unrest. By contrast, the stable hereditary working class tend to be surprisingly non-revolutionary. Even in the case of the German workers who were cited by Marx and Engels as models for the European proletariat, the majority did not support the Spartacists in 1919. They returned large majorities of official social democrats to the Congress of Workers' Councils and to the Reichstag in later years, rallied consistently behind the Social Democratic Party right up to 1933. The most promising development in the factories today is the emergence of young workers who smoke pot, fuck off on their jobs, drift into and out of factories, grow long or longish hair, demand more leisure time rather than pay, steal, harass all authority figures, go on wildcats, and turn on their fellow workers. Even more promising is the emergence of this human type in trade schools and high schools, the reservoir of the industrial working class to come. To the degree that workers, vocational students, and high school students link their lifestyles to various aspects of the anarchic youth culture, to that degree will the proletariat be transformed from a force for the conservation of the established order into a force for revolution.
A qualitatively new situation emerges when man is faced with the transformation from a repressive class society based on material scarcity into a liberatory classless society based on material abundance. From the decomposing traditional class structure, a new human type is created in ever-increasing numbers, the revolutionary. This revolutionary begins to challenge not only the economic and political premises of a hierarchical society, but hierarchy as such. It not only raises the need for social revolution, but also tries to live in a revolutionary manner to the degree that it is possible in the existing society. Bookchin here deviates into an extremely long footnote, which I read now. This revolutionary lifestyle may develop in the factories as well as on the streets, in schools as well as in crash pads, in the suburbs as well as on the Bay Area East Side axis. Its essence is defiance and in a personal propaganda of the deed that erodes all the mores, institutions, and shibboleths of domination. Society begins to approach the threshold of the revolutionary period. Factories, schools, and neighborhoods become the actual arena of revolutionary play, a play that has a very serious core. Strikes become a chronic condition and are called for their own sake to break the veneer of routine, to defy the society on an almost hourly basis, to shatter the mood of bourgeois normality. This new mood of the workers, students, and neighborhood people is a vital precursor to the actual moment of revolutionary transformation. Its most conscious expression is the demand for self-management. The worker refuses to be managed being, a class being. This process was the most evident in Spain on the eve of the 1936 revolution, when workers in almost every city and town called strikes for the hell of it to express their independence, their sense of awakening, their break with the social order and with bourgeois conditions of life. It was also an essential feature of the 1968 general strike in France. That's the end of the footnote, and we return to the main text. Not only attacks the forms created by the legacy of domination, but also improvises new forms of liberation, make their poetry from the future.
This preparation for the future, this experimentation with liberatory post-scarcity forms of social relations, may be illusory if the future involves a substitution of one class society by another. It is indispensable, however, if the future involves a classless society built on the ruins of a class society. What then will be the agent of revolutionary change? It will be literally the great majority of society, drawn from all the different traditional classes and fused into a common revolutionary force by the decomposition of the institutions, social forms, values, and lifestyles of the prevailing class structure. Typically, its most advanced elements are the youth, a generation that has known no chronic economic crisis and that is becoming less and less oriented toward the myth of material security, so widespread among the generation of the 30s. If it is true that a social revolution cannot be achieved without the active or passive support of the workers, it is no less true that it cannot be achieved without the active or passive support of the farmers, technicians, and professionals. Above all, a social revolution cannot be achieved without the support of the youth, from which the ruling class recruits its armed forces. If the ruling class retains its armed might, the revolution is lost, no matter how many workers rally to its support. This has been vividly demonstrated not only in Spain, but not only by Spain in the 30s, but by Hungary in the 50s and Czechoslovakia in the 60s. The revolution of today, by its very nature, indeed, by its pursuit of wholeness, wins not. I think there's a typo there. Wins not only the soldier and the worker, but the very generation from which soldiers, workers, technicians, farmers, scientists, professionals, and even bureaucrats have been recruited. Discarding the tactical handbooks of the past, the revolution of the future follows the path of least resistance, eating its way into the most susceptible areas of the population, irrespective of their class position. It is nourished by all the contradictions in bourgeois society, not simply by the contradictions of the 1860s and 1917. Hence, it attracts all those who feel the burdens of exploitation, poverty, racism, imperialism, and yes, those whose lives are frustrated by consumerism, suburbia, the mass media, the family, school, the supermarket, and the prevailing system of repressed sexuality. Here, the form of the revolution becomes as total as its contentless, content, classless, propertyless, content. I think that's an M dash maybe. Here the form of the revolution becomes as total as its content, classless, propertyless, hierarchyless, and wholly liberating.
To barge in.
Actually, maybe I'll. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, no, you can finish it. I thought you were going to finish it because we were so close.
Oh yeah, I'll go ahead and finish it then. To barge into this revolutionary development with the worn recipes of Marxism, to babble about a class line and the role of the working class, amounts to a subversion of the present and the future by the past. To elaborate this deadening ideology by babbling about cadres, a vanguard party, democratic centralism, and the proletarian dictatorship is sheer counter-revolution. It is to this matter of the organizational question, this vital contribution of Leninism to Marxism, that we must now direct some attention. And I think we'll pause here for comments.
Yeah, I just want to hit one of these notes again because it's my favorite part of this essay that I it's the best. The most promising development in the factories today is the emergence of young workers who smoke pot, fuck off on their jobs, drift into and out of factories, grow long or longish hair, demand more leisure time rather than more pay, steal, harass all authority figures, go on wildcat strikes, and turn on their fellow workers. This passage has so much to unpack, and it's such a, like, I love that the anti-authoritarian, the way that he is sort of sewing together like the anti-authoritarian youth cultural movements into a crisis, into a criticism rather of hierarchism as a whole, hierarchy across all of society, and that he makes this provocative statement where he says, no, the best worker isn't the one that cuts his hair really short to his head and then rubs elbows with the working class Joes and is like, oh, I like sports like you. Hey, by the way, in addition to sports, what about a vanguard party? Another bad idea. Saying like, no, that's not like the best strategy, which is actually like Bookchin had the experience of trying to do that for a decade, which is part of the reason why he came to sort of the conclusion of rejecting the workerist form. That's not the best form. The thing I like the most is when people smoke weed, slack off, steal from their bosses, and don't have any solidarity with it's an amazing provocation, and I think by far my favorite part.
I'd just like to add, it's interesting. Harrison just mentioned in the chat it's a lot of these early passages where he's talking about the counterculture, giving this very anti-workerist kind of vision of a revolutionary character. In his later dispute with Bob Black, Black actually quotes a load of this stuff from the early Bookchin as a way he thinks of showing up Bookchin's kind of self-contradiction, because obviously later on in social anarchism or lifestyle anarchism, an unbridgeable chasm. I'll pop that in the chat for the links later. He seems to possibly renege on some of these earlier ideas about what it means to lead a revolutionary existence, I suppose. It's interesting. I mean, I guess it's up for debate whether Bookchin's being a self-contradictory person there, or his ideas just developed or whatever. I just wanted to really quickly point out as well, whilst we're at this this break, I don't know if people in Discord are following it, but there's some really quality chat going on in the YouTube chat itself, and I just wanted to share a couple of highlights in case there's anything we want to address. So Guapo Desperados again taken Bookchin to task a bit for his arrogance in failing to foresee a retraction of post-scarcity. So Guapo has pointed out this text has Bookchin laying into a lot of Marxists for failing to foresee abundance and post-scarcity. Guapo says, well, doesn't Bookchin himself in the 60s fail to foresee the climate catastrophe, fail to foresee all of these pressures that may reintroduce some level of material scarcity again? And so that's an interesting critique about maybe this piece is a little dated. I don't know. Another oversight rightly brought up by James Arnott is that Bookchin wrongly calls the British Isles England, thereby erasing Welsh, Scottish, and other non-English identities. That's a mistake that a lot of American authors make, perhaps. I'll just hand over if anyone else has any quick comments. That was just a selection that caught my eye.
So yeah, we've just had some mild technical issues, and I've just been told that I was actually muted for part of that too through YouTube. So I'll very quickly just say again, the basic premise I was putting forward is that scarcity is a relationship between individuals and the environment. It's not just a mere matter of the environment. There's very, very rare situations where there's actually a true, legit scarcity. And I think that we continue to have the technological capacity for post-scarcity as long as a sufficient human population exists. But I guess there's a theoretical point where you have a tailspin sort of situation. Yeah, I can hand it off to you now, James.
Yeah, I just wanted to very briefly add as well that it's important when talking about what is claimed by advocates or foreseers of post-scarcity, how literally the total absence of scarcity should be taken in this. So, it's completely true that there are technical material limits, and there always will be technical material limits on the substances of life. There's never going to be a literally infinite supply of resources. Someone in the YouTube chat said, as an example of this, we can't all have 100 square acre ranches or something. Not everybody can have I don't know, a cattle ranch, for example, but everybody can have a house or, a quite nice house. Everybody can have enough food to eat. So it's a question of, how literally are we, is a proponent of post-scarcity like Bookchin saying, we really don't have to worry about scarcity anymore. It's about those levels, isn't it? And I agree with you, Sean, that except, we can perhaps work to the assumption that, the levels of scarcity, we have to hope, I suppose, that levels of material scarcity won't return to pre-industrial levels. But anyway, I'm going to hand it off now and let it carry on.
Am I coming through now? Let me know. Okay, awesome. Just very shortly, I just wanted to say that famines, including, there's an extent to which social systems create famines, but famines were not very uncommon, even up until like the 70s. And we in the first world are buffered significantly by them. Well, now, and really just pretty much less than 100 years we've had that buffer. And I think especially with the coming, ever approaching climate catastrophe, which is going to wreck food production throughout a lot of parts of the world, although it's going to open up other parts as well. There's the potential for that buffer to greatly disappear. And I think we are, although there is the potential for us to figure out what we need to do to get rid of that, to make sure that people have enough to eat. There's also the very real potential that if we don't approach that correctly, that desert is doesn't have the political approach that I agree with, but certainly the analysis of the fact that it is entirely possible for us to go back into this situation where we have extreme famine as a not that uncommon thing is very potential. And also the fact that here in the first world, a great deal of our abundance is dependent upon a certain level of exploitation of the third world. And if we were to truly even things out a bit, we in the first world would have to make do with less. And I think that's fine. But that's even in our current system of, famines being a little bit less common. If those things were evened out in a way and we had no less buffer for famine because of climate, I think we would have to restructure certain things, potentially.
I think there's some really, really good points there. And just a point that James made in the chat, the 1840s was known as the Hungry 40s because so many famines happened across Europe then. So, yeah, and I think in terms of your bigger point there, Harrison, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, even though I have a principled disagreement with you, I really want to hash out and it would be really fun. I want to get through this text. So basically what I'm going to say is we're going to open up this discussion on scarcity in a very, very explicit way in the next book club meetings, which happen off the record, which everyone's that has happened not streamed, in the Discord chat next Wednesday at 7 and 23 GMT, depending on your thing. So there's a lot to talk about in some of these scarcity debates, and we'll definitely talk about that another time, Harrison. I'll and James posed the counter perspective. He thinks that sort of Western living standards could be met for all humans. Well, there's a lot of interesting discussion that we can have on this, but
with caveats.
With caveats, yeah. Well, an interesting thing that it reminds me of, and I apologize because I don't want to say anything, but I'm going to say one thing, is that because of COVID-19, everyone's behavior changed a lot, and we only saw a decrease in emissions by a very small amount. I think it was like 5%-ish happened from everyone staying home across North America, where for contrast, all fossil fuel infrastructure, energy that's used pulling fossil fuels out of the ground, takes up about 12% of the global energy. So there's where the different where we need to cut down within the overall society. I obviously come from the perspective that I think a lot of what we have can be maintained. And I'm sorry, I want to give Harrison, if you want to make a brief comment, I couldn't resist disagreeing with you, and it's not fair, before I begin to read this next piece. Okay, it looks like Harrison's typing, and
No, I'm yeah, totally. Like, I absolutely think that's an entirely valid perspective. I definitely want to talk about it more, and I'm very interested. I guess the potential decrease in living standards is not necessarily the main issue I have, but more the fact that because of climate, famine as a whole and scarcity as a whole may become more common overall for everyone, and that may be a thing we have to deal with. That's my main point.
Yeah, and I think that is an extremely pertinent point. That if we tried to pretend wasn't a factor in our analysis, it would definitely leave a big blind spot of, like, we can't keep business going as it's going. But I'm going to pick up reading because I want to make sure that we can get this text out in a form that people can listen to by next week. So the next heading, the myth of the party. So for context, he had just said this was a contribution of Leninism to Marxism that he needed to direct some attention to. Social revolutions are not made by parties, groups, or cadres. They occur as a result of deep-seated historic forces and contradictions that activate large sections of the population. They occur not merely because the masses find the existing society intolerable, as Trotsky argued, but also because of the tension between the actual and the possible, between what is and what could be. Abject misery alone does not produce revolutions. More often than not, it produces an aimless demoralization, or worse, a private, personalized struggle to survive. The Russian Revolution of 1917 weighs on the brain of the living like a nightmare because it was largely the product of intolerable conditions, of a devastating imperialistic war. Whatever dreams it had were virtually destroyed by an even bloodier civil war, by famine, and by treachery. What emerged from the revolutions were the ruins not of an old society, but of whatever hopes existed to achieve a new one. The Russian Revolution failed miserably. It replaced Tsarism by state capitalism, and a rather lengthy footnote begins, a fact which Trotsky never understood. He never followed through the consequences of his own concept of combined development to its logical conclusions. He saw quite correctly that Tsarist Russia, the latecomer in the European bourgeois development, necessarily acquired the most advanced industrial and class forms instead of recapitulating the entire bourgeois development from its beginning. He neglected to consider that Russia, torn by tremendous internal upheaval, might even run ahead of the capitalist development elsewhere in Europe. Hypnotized by the formula nationalized property equals socialism, he failed to recognize that monopoly capitalism itself tends to amalgamate with the state by its own inner dialectic. The Bolsheviks, having cleared away the traditional forms of bourgeois social organizations, which still act as a rein on the state capitalist development in Europe and America, inadvertently prepared the ground for a pure state capitalist development, which the state finally becomes the ruling class. Lacking support from a technologically advanced Europe, the Russian revolutions became an internal counter-revolution. Soviet Russia became a form of state capitalism that does not benefit the whole people. Lenin's analogy between socialism and state capitalism became a terrifying reality under Stalin. Despite its humanistic core, Marxism failed to comprehend how much of its concept of socialism approximates a later stage of capitalism itself, the return to mercantile forms on a higher industrial level. The failure to understand this development led to devastating theoretical confusion in the contemporary revolutionary movement, as witness the splits among the Trotskyists over this question. The Bolsheviks were the tragic victims of their own ideology and paid with their lives in great numbers during the purges of the 30s. To attempt to acquire any unique wisdom from the scarcity revolution is ridiculous. What we can learn from the revolutions of the past is what all revolutions have in common, and their profound limitations compared with the enormous possibilities that are now open to us. The most striking feature of the past revolutions is that they began spontaneously. I can hand that off to you, Alicia, if you're ready.
Certainly. Whether one chooses to examine the opening phases of the French Revolution of 1789, the revolutions of 1848, the Paris Commune, the 1905 revolution in Russia, the overthrow of the Tsar in 1917, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, or the French General Strike of 1968, the opening stages are generally the same. A period of ferment explodes spontaneously into a mass upsurge. Whether the upsurge is successful or not depends on its resoluteness and on whether the troops go over the people. The glorious party, when there is one, almost invariably lags behind the events. In February 1917, the Petrograd organization of the Bolsheviks opposed the calling of strikes precisely on the eve of the revolution, which was designed to overthrow the Tsar. Fortunately, the workers ignored the Bolshevik directives and went on strike anyway. In the events which followed, no one was more surprised by the revolution than the, quote, revolutionary parties, including the Bolsheviks. As the Bolshevik leader, Kirov, recalled, quote, absolutely no guiding initiatives from the party were felt. The Petrograd Committee had been arrested, and the representative from the Central Committee, Comrade Shlapinov, was unable to give any directives for the coming day, end quote. Perhaps this was fortunate. Before the Petrograd Committee was arrested, its evaluation of the situation and its own role had been so dismal that, had the workers followed its guidance, it is doubtful that the revolution would have occurred when it did. The same kind of story could be told of the upsurges which preceded 1917 and those which followed. To cite only the most recent, the student uprising and general strike in France during May-June 1968. There is a convenient tendency to forget that close to a dozen, quote, tightly centralized Bolshevik-type organizations existed in Paris at this time. It is rarely mentioned that virtually every one of these, quote, vanguard groups disdained the student uprising up to May 7, when the street fighting broke out in earnest. The Trotskyist Jeunesse Communiste Révolutionnaire was a notable exception, and it merely coasted along, essentially following the initiatives of the March 22nd movement. Can someone take over from there?
Up to May 7th, all the Maoist groups criticized the student uprising as peripheral and unimportant. The Trotskyist Fédération des Étudiants Révolutionnaires regarded it as, quote, adventuristic and tried to get the students to leave the barricades on May 10th. The Communist Party, of course, played a completely treacherous role. Far from leading the popular movement, the Maoists and the Trotskyists were its captives throughout. Ironically, most of these Bolshevik groups used manipulative techniques shamelessly in the Sorbonne Student Assembly in an attempt to, quote, control it, introducing a disruptive atmosphere that demoralized the entire body. Finally, to complete the irony, all of these Bolshevik groups were to babble about the need for, quote, centralized leadership when the popular movement collapsed, a movement that occurred despite their directives and often in opposition to them. Revolutions and uprisings worthy of any note not only have an initial phase that is magnificently anarchic, but also tend spontaneously to create their own forms of revolutionary self-management. The Parisian sections of 1793 to 94 were the most remarkable forms of self-management to be created by any of the social revolutions in history. More familiar in form were the councils or Soviets, which the Petrograd workers established in 1905. Although less democratic than the sections, the councils were to reappear in a number of later revolutions. Still another form of revolutionary self-management were the factory committees, which the anarchists established in the Spanish Revolution of 1936. Finally, the sections reappeared as student assemblies and action committees in the May-June uprising and general strike in Paris in 1968. Footnote. With a sublime arrogance that is attributable partly to ignorance, a number of Marxist groups were to dub virtually all of the above forms of self-management as Soviets. The attempt to bring all of these different forms under a single rubric is not only misleading, but willfully obscurantist. The actual Soviets were the least democratic of the revolutionary forms, and Bolsheviks shrewdly used them to transfer the power to their own party. The Soviets were not based on a face-to-face democracy, like the Parisian sections or the student assemblies of 1968. Nor were they based on economic self-management like the Spanish anarchist factory committees. The Soviets actually formed a workers' parliament, hierarchically organized, which drew its representation from factories and later from military units and peasant villages. At this point, we must ask what role the Revolutionary Party plays in all these developments. In the beginning, as we have seen, it tends to have an inhibitory function, not a vanguard role. Where it exercises an influence, it tends to slow down the flow of events, not coordinate the revolutionary forces. This is not accidental. The party is structured along hierarchical lines that reflect the very society it professes to oppose. Despite its theoretical pretensions, it is a bourgeois organism, a miniature state, with an apparatus and a cadre whose function is to seize power, not dissolve power. Rooted in pre-revolutionary period, it assimilates all the forms, techniques, and mentality of bureaucracy. Its membership is schooled in obedience and the preconceptions of a rich dogma, and is taught to revere the leadership. The party's leadership, in turn, is schooled in habits born of command, authority, manipulation, and egomania. The situation is worsened when the party participates in parliamentary elections. In election campaigns, the vanguard party models itself completely on existing bourgeois forms and even acquires the paraphernalia of the electoral party. The situation assumes truly critical proportions when the party acquires large presses, costly headquarters, and a large inventory of centrally controlled periodicals and develops a paid apparatus. In short, a bureaucracy with vested material interests.
As the party expands, the distance between the leadership and the ranks invariably increases. Its leaders not only become personages, they lose contact with the living situation below. The local groups, which know their own immediate situation better than any remote leader, are obliged to subordinate their insights to directives from above. Leadership, lacking any direct knowledge of local problems, responds sluggishly and prudently. Although it stakes out a claim to the larger view, to greater theoretical competence, the competence of the leadership tends to diminish as one ascends the hierarchy of command. The more one approaches the level where the real decisions are made, the more conservative is the nature of the decision-making process. The more bureaucratic and extraneous are the factors which come into play. The more considerations of prestige and retrenchment supplant creativity, imagination, and a disinterested dedication to revolutionary goals. The party becomes less efficient from a revolutionary point of view, the more it seeks efficiency by means of hierarchy, cadres, and centralization. Although everyone marches in step, the orders are usually wrong, especially when events begin to move rapidly and make unexpected turns, as they do in all revolutions. The party is efficient only in one respect, in molding society in its own hierarchical image if the revolution is successful. It recreates bureaucracy, centralization, and the state. Fosters bureaucracy centralization in the state. It fosters the very social conditions which justify this kind of society. Hence, instead of withering away, the state controlled by the quote-unquote glorious party preserves the very conditions which necessitate the existence of a state and a party to guard it.
On the other hand, this kind of party is extremely vulnerable in periods of repression. The bourgeoisie has only to grab its leadership to destroy virtually the entire movement. With its leaders in prison or in hiding, the party becomes paralyzed. The obedient membership has no one to obey and tends to flounder. Demoralization sets in rapidly. The party decomposes not only because of the repressive atmosphere, but also because of its poverty of inner resources. The foregoing account is not a series of hypothetical inferences. It is a composite sketch of all the mass Marxian parties of the past century: the Social Democrats, the Communists, the Trotskyist Party of Ceylon, the only mass party of its kind. To claim that these parties failed to take their Marxian principles seriously merely conceals another question. Why did this failure happen in the first place? The fact is, these parties were co-opted into bourgeois society because they were structured along bourgeois lines. The germ of treachery existed in them from birth. The Bolshevik Party was spared this fate between 1904 and 1917 for only one reason. It was an illegal organization during most of the years leading up to the revolution. The party was continually being shattered and reconstituted, with the result that until it took power, it never really hardened into a fully centralized bureaucratic, hierarchical machine. Moreover, it was riddled by factions. The intensely factional atmosphere persisted throughout 1917 into the Civil War. Nevertheless, the Bolshevik leadership was ordinarily extremely conservative, a trait that Lenin had to fight throughout 1917. First, in his efforts to reorient the Central Committee against the provisional government, the famous conflict over the April Theses. Later, in driving the Central Committee toward insurrection in October. In both cases, he threatened to resign from the Central Committee and bring his views to the lower ranks of the party.
Looks like we're having another mild tech issue, but here I can pick up, and then we'll see if our new person's able to get their mic going. In 1918, factional disputes over the issue of the Brest-Litovsk the Brest-Litovsk treaty became so serious that the Bolsheviks nearly split into two warring communist parties. Oppositional Bolshevik groups like Democratic Centralists Oppositional Bolshevik groups like the Democratic Centralists and the Workers' Opposition waged bitter struggles within the party throughout 1919 and 1920, not to speak of oppositional movements that developed within the Red Army over Trotsky's propensity for centralization. The complete centralization of the Bolshevik Party, the achievement of Leninist unity, as it was to be called later, did not occur until 1921, when Lenin succeeded in persuading the 10th Party Congress to ban factions. By this time, most of the White Guards had been crushed, and the foreign interventionists had withdrawn their troops from Russia. It cannot be stressed too strongly that the Bolsheviks tended to centralize their party to the degree that they became isolated from the working class. This relationship has rarely been investigated in latter-day Leninist circles, although Lenin was honest enough to admit it. The story of the Russian Revolution is not merely the story of the Bolshevik Party and its supporters. Beneath the veneer of official events described by Soviet historians, there was another, more basic development, the spontaneous movement of the workers and revolutionary peasants, which later clashed sharply with the bureaucratic policies of the Bolsheviks. With the overdue With the overthrow of the Tsar in February 1917, workers in virtually all of the factories of Russia spontaneously established factory committees, staking out an increasing claim on industrial operations. In June 1917, an all-Russian conference of factory committees was held in Petrograd, which called for the organization of thorough control by labor over production and distribution.
The demands of this conference are rarely mentioned in Leninist accounts of Russian Revolution, despite the fact that the conference aligned itself with the Bolsheviks. Trotsky, who describes the factory committees as the most direct and indubitable representation of the proletariat in the whole country, deals with them peripherally in his massive 3-volume history of the revolution. Yet so important... Thank you. Yet so important were these spontaneous organisms of self-management that Lenin, despairing of winning the Soviets in the summer of 1917, was prepared to jettison the slogan "All power to the Soviets" for "All power to the factory committees." This demand would have catapulted the Bolsheviks into a complacency anarcho-syndicalist position, although it is doubtful that they would have remained there very long. With the October Revolution, all the factory committees seized control of the plants, ousting the bourgeoisie and completely taking control of industry, and accepting the concept of workers' control. Lenin's famous decree of November 14, 1917, merely acknowledged as accomplished fact the Bolsheviks dared not oppose the workers at this early date, but they began to whittle down the power of the factory committees. In 1918, a scant 2 months after decreeing workers' control, Lenin began to advocate that the administration of the factories be placed under trade union control. The story that the Bolsheviks patiently experimented with workers' control only to find it inefficient and chaotic is a myth. Their patience did not last more than a few weeks. Not only did Lenin oppose direct workers' control within a matter of weeks after the decree of November 14th, even union control came to an end shortly after it had been established. By the summer of 1918, almost all of Russian industry had been placed under bourgeois forms of management. As Lenin put it, the revolution demands, precisely in the interests of socialism, that the masses unquestionably obey a single will of the leaders of the labor process. Therefore, workers' control was denounced not only as inefficient, chaotic, and impractical, but also petty bourgeois. Blah. The left communist Osinski bitterly attacked all these spurious claims and warned the party, socialism and socialist organization must be set up by the proletariat itself, or they will not be set up at all. Something else will be set up, state capitalism. In the interests of socialism, the Bolshevik Party elbowed the proletariat out of every domain it had conquered by its own efforts and initiative. The party did not coordinate the revolution or even lead it. It dominated it. First, workers' control and later union control were replaced by an elaborate hierarchy as monstrous as any structure that existed in pre-revolutionary times. As later years were to demonstrate, Osinski's prophecy became reality. The problem of who is to prevail, the Bolsheviks or the Russian masses, was by no means limited to factor. Oh wow, that's a little tiny. If someone else wants to read that footnote, or I could just keep going. Whatever's clever.
Here, I can pick up the footnote here. And this was. At the top of the page there, it says, as Lenin put it, the revolution demands precisely in the interests of socialism that the masses unquestionably obey the single will of the leaders in the labor process. An interesting quote, no matter who said it. And here's the footnote. Sort of a weird thing to say, Lenin. The immediate tasks of the Soviet government, in Selected Works, Volume 7, page 342. In this harsh article published in April 1918, Lenin completely abandoned the libertarian perspective he advanced in the year before in State and Revolution. The main themes of the article are the needs for discipline, for authoritarian control over factories, and for the institutions of the Taylor system, a system Lenin had denounced before the revolution as enslaving man to the machine. So the Taylor system was like a highly regimented workers. It was like a capitalist innovation on how to get more labor out of workers in less time, and this was something that they we put as a footnote: scientific management, basically like trying to make work efficiently optimized for profit. Something that Lenin critiqued and then embraced and applied. The main themes of the article, The article was written during a comparatively peaceful period of Bolshevik rule, some 2 months after the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. I love how I had to say that again. And a month before the revolt of the Czech Legion in the Urals, the revolt that started the civil war on a wide scale and opened the period of direct Allied intervention in Russia. Finally, the article was written nearly a year before the defeat of the German Revolution. It would be difficult to account for the immediate tasks merely in terms of the Russian Civil War and the failure of the European Revolution.
Was by no means limited to the factories. There we go. Perfect smooth transition. We did it. The issue reappeared in the countryside as well as the cities. A sweeping peasant war had buoyed up the movement of the workers. Contrary to official Leninist accounts, the agrarian upsurge was by no means limited to a redistribution of the land into private plots. In the Ukraine, peasants influenced by the anarchist militias of Nestor Makhno, I guess, and guided by the communist maxim, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, established a multitude of rural communes. Elsewhere in the North and in the Soviet Asia, several thousand of these organisms were established, partly on the initiative of the left social revolutionaries, and in large measure as a result of traditional collectivist impulses, which stemmed from Russian village, the Mir. It matters little whether these communes were numerous or embraced large numbers of peasants. The point is that they were authentic popular organisms, the nuclei of a moral and social spirit that ranged far above the dehumanizing values of bourgeois society. The Bolsheviks frowned upon these organisms from the very beginning and eventually condemned them. To Lenin, the more socialist form of agricultural enterprise was represented by the state farm, an agricultural factory in which the state owned the land and farming equipment, appointing managers who hired peasants on a wage basis. One sees in these attitudes towards workers' control and agricultural communes the essentially bourgeois spirit and mentality that permeated the Bolshevik Party, a spirit and mentality that emerged not only from its theories, but also from its corporate mode of organization. In December 1918, Lenin launched an attack against the communes on the pretext that peasants were being forced to enter them. Actually, little if any coercion was used to organize these communistic forms of self-management. As Robert G. Wesson, who studied the Soviet communes in detail, concludes, those who went into communes must have done so largely of their own volition. The communes were not suppressed, but their growth was discouraged until Stalin merged the entire development into the forced collectivization drives of the late 20s and early 30s. By 1920, the Bolsheviks had isolated themselves from the Russian working class and peasantry, taken together the elimination of workers' control and suppression of the Makhnovsky, the restrictive political atmosphere in the country, the inflated bureaucracy, and the crushing material poverty inherited from the Civil War years generated a deep hostility toward Bolshevik rule. With the end of hostilities, a movement surged up from the depths of Russian society for a third revolution, not to restore the past, as the Bolsheviks claimed, but to realize the very goals of freedom, economic as well as political, that had rallied the masses around the Bolshevik program of 1917. The new movement found its most conscious form in the Petrograd proletariat and among the Kronstadt sailors. It also found expression in the party the growth of anti-centralist and anarcho-syndicalist tendencies among the Bolsheviks reached a point where a block of oppositional groups oriented towards these issues gained 124 seats at Moscow Provincial Conference as against 154 for supporters of the Central Committee. Ooh, I need some water.
On March 2, 1921, the Red Sailors of Kronstadt rose in open rebellion, raising the banner of a third revolution of the toilers. The Kronstadt program centered around demands for free election to the Soviets, freedom of speech and press for the anarchists and the left socialist parties, free trade unions, and the liberation of all prisoners who belonged to socialist parties. The most shameless stories were fabricated by the Bolsheviks to account for this uprising, acknowledged in later years as brazen lies. The revolt was characterized as a White Guard plot, despite the fact that the great majority of Communist Party members in Kronstadt joined the sailors, precisely as communists, in denouncing the party leaders as betrayers of the October Revolution. As Robert Vincent Daniels observes in his study of Bolshevik oppositional movements, quote, ordinary communists were indeed so unreliable that the government did not depend on them either in the assault on Kronstadt itself or in keeping order in Petrograd, where Kronstadt's hopes for support chiefly rested. The main body of troops employed were Chekists and officer cadets from Red Army training schools. The final assault on Kronstadt was led by the top officialdom of the Communist Party. A large group of delegates to the 10th Party Congress was rushed from Moscow for this purpose. End quote. So weak was the regime internally that the elite had to do its own dirty work. Even more significant than the Kronstadt revolt was the strike movement that developed among the Petrograd workers, a movement that sparked the uprising of the sailors. Leninist histories do not recount this critically important development. The first strikes broke out in the Trubachny factory on February 23, 1921. Within a matter of days, the movement swept one factory after another, until by February 28, the famous Pulitov works, the quote, crucible of the revolution, went on strike. Not only were economic demands raised, the workers raised distinctly political ones, anticipating all the demands that were to be raised by the Kronstadt sailors a few days later. On February 24, the Bolsheviks declared a, quote, state of siege in Petrograd and arrested the strike leaders, suppressing the workers' demonstrations with officer cadets. The fact is, the Bolsheviks did not merely suppress a sailors' mutiny, they crushed the working class itself. It was at this point that Lenin demanded the banning of factions in the Russian Communist Party. Centralization of the party was now complete, and the way was paved for Stalin and for NMS to go next.
We have discussed these events in detail because they lead to a conclusion that the latest crop of Marxist-Leninists tend to avoid. The Bolshevik Party reached its maximum degree of centralization in Lenin's day, not to achieve a revolution or suppress a White Guard counter-revolution, but to effect a counter-revolution of its own against the very social forces it professed to represent. Factions were prohibited, and a monolithic party created not to prevent a capitalist restoration, but to contain a mass movement of workers for Soviet democracy and social freedom. The Lenin of 1921 stood opposed to the Lenin of 1917. Thereafter, Lenin simply floundered.
This man, who above all sought to anchor the problems of his party in social contradictions, found himself literally playing an organizational numbers game in a last-ditch attempt to arrest the very bureaucratization he himself had created. There's nothing more pathetic and tragic than Lenin's last years. Paralyzed by a simplistic body of Marxist formulas, he can think of no better countermeasures than organizational ones. He proposes the formation of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection to correct bureaucratic deformations in the party and state, and this body falls under Stalin's control and becomes highly bureaucratic in its own right. Lenin then suggests that the size of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection be reduced and that it be merged with the Control Commission. He advocates enlarging the Central Committee. Thus, it rolls along. This body to be enlarged, that one to be merged with another, still a third to be modified or abolished. The strange ballet of organizational forms continues up to his very death, as though the problem could be resolved by organizational means. As Moshe Lewin, an obvious admirer of Lenin, admits, the Bolshevik leader approached the problems of government more like a chief executive of a strictly elitist turn of mind. He did not apply methods of social analysis to the government and was content to consider it purely in terms of organizational methods.
Take this one, if you're happy for me to, word. If it's true that in the bourgeois revolutions, praise went beyond the content, in the Bolshevik Revolution, forms replaced the content. The Soviets replaced the workers and their factory committees, the party replaced the Soviets, the Central Committee replaced the party, and the Politburo replaced the Central Committee. In short, means replaced ends. This incredible substitution of form for content is one of the most characteristic traits of Marxism and Leninism. In France, during the May-June events, the 1968 ones, all the Bolshevik organizations were prepared to destroy the Sorbonne Student Assembly in order to increase their influence and membership. The principal concern was not the revolution or the authentic social forms created by the students, but the growth of their own parties. Only one force could have arrested the growth of bureaucracy in Russia, a social force. The Russian proletariat and peasantry succeeded in increasing the domain of self-management through the development of viable factory committees, rural communes, and free Soviets. The history of the country might have taken a dramatically different turn. There can be no question the failure of socialist revolutions in Europe after the First World War led to the isolation of the revolution in Russia. Material poverty of Russia, coupled with the pressure of the surrounding capitalist world, really militated against the development of a socialist or consistently libertarian society. By no means was it ordained that Russia had to develop along state capitalist lines. Contrary to Lenin's and Trotsky's initial expectations, the revolution was defeated by internal forces, not by an invasion of armies from abroad. The movement from below restored the initial achievements of the revolution in 1917, a multifaceted social structure might have developed based on workers' control of industry, on a freely developing peasant economy, in agriculture, and on a living interplay of ideas, programs, and political movements. At the very least, Russia would not have been imprisoned in totalitarian chains, and Stalinism would not have poisoned the world revolutionary movement, paving the way for fascism and the Second.
The development of the Bolshevik Party, however, precluded this development, Lenin's or Trotsky's good intentions notwithstanding. By destroying the power of the factory committees in industry and by crushing the Makhnovsky, the Petrograd workers and the Kronstadt sailors, the Bolsheviks virtually guaranteed the triumph of the Russian bureaucracy over Russian society. The centralized party, a completely bourgeois institution, became the refuge of counter-revolution in its most sinister form. This was covert counter-revolution that draped itself in the red flag and the terminology of Marx. Ultimately, what the Bolsheviks suppressed in 1921 was not an ideology or a white guard conspiracy, but an elemental struggle of the Russian people to free themselves of their shackles and take control of their own destiny. And here there's a footnote. In interpreting this elemental movement of the Russian workers and peasants as a series of white guard conspiracies, acts of kulak resistance, and plots of international capital, the Bolsheviks reached an incredible theoretical low and deceived no one but themselves. A spiritual erosion developed within the party that paved the way for the politics of the secret police, for character assassination, and finally for the Moscow trials and the annihilation of the old Bolshevik cadre. One sees the return of this odious mentality in the PL articles like Marcuse, Cop Out or Cop, the theme of which is to establish Marcuse as an agent of the CIA. See Progressive Labor, February 1969. The article has a caption under a photograph of demonstrating Parisians, which reads, Marcuse got to Paris too late to stop the May action. Opponents of the PLP are invariably described by this rag as red baiters and as anti-worker. If the American left does not repudiate this police approach and character assassination, it will pay bitterly in the years to come. That's the end of the footnote. For Russia, this meant the nightmare of Stalinist dictatorship. For the generation of the 30s, it meant the horror of fascism and the treachery of the communist parties in Europe and the United States. That's the end of that section.
Okay, so we have, in discussions that we were having in the chat while we were reading, we've decided that we're going to split this one up into 2 weeks because there's a lot of stuff to digest that we've tackled so far, and we want to make sure that we have enough time to really get into the stuff that we talked about so far. So thanks to everyone who's helped read this week, who watched along on YouTube or listened along on Discord. Hopefully you got some interesting ideas out of this. I had a lot of fun doing it myself, and it's just always really stimulating to hear people's takes on this sort of stuff. So I wanted to open up the floor for folks who are here right now. If we wanted to go around and have some sort of closing comments on the first half of the chapter of Listen Marxist. And maybe we can do something like a stack in the chat if people want to get on to that. I will say I think that this critique is it's an excellent polemic in both the context that it was written and a lot of it's applicable today. He makes generalizations and he talks quite bitterly about certain tendencies and stuff like that. But if you can pull that apart and just focus on, I mean, if you can pull that apart from some of the substance of the ideas here, and I think there's some really interesting history and some profound observations on it that's worthy of thinking about.
Yeah, the Kronstadt test case is particularly interesting, isn't it, in terms of the kind of narrative of the revolution betrayed type thing, and it's that's been a staple of, I suppose, of anarchist critiques of Marxism. I don't think Bookchin's the first to point to the suppression of the Kronstadt rebellion as like emblematic of Marxist-Leninism in practice, contrary to whatever its potential were pre-revolution, you
know. Since no one's speaking at the moment, I'll jump in. I was actually thinking about specifically like the relationship between like the Kronstadt and like the Makhnovites and the Petrograd workers and so on. Like the interesting thing I have seen is that everyone knows like the Makhnovshchina was anarchist and had like ideologically anarchist organization. Like the Nabat, Volin, that it had an organization besides just Makhno being the army leader. But the Kronstadt organization, a lot of people aren't as familiar with the fact that the leaders of the Kronstadt revolution were also like some of the big ones were both went back and forth between membership in like the Bolshevik stuff and also identifying as anarchists, which is interesting to see specifically like the relationship between people's political identification and their actual spontaneous organization, like the common people like doing and setting up these like in 1905 these these Soviets or other things that were just free associations of people organizing, and then that their relationship between the like different anarchist or when at the time in 1917 when Lenin wrote State and Revolution and called for Soviet power, versus later and so on, like the relationship between like what people are actually doing and the membership and relationship with the organizations that wanted to organize them.
Yeah, that's a really good point, H. And I just wanted to add what you've just said about that interesting distinction between like political self-identification and the way the dominoes fall on the ground in sort of organizational form. It really reminds me of a quote from Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell, where he's describing obviously the Barcelona May Days, and he has this very memorable quote where he says something words to the effect of I may not be an anarchist. He was obviously a Trotskyist himself. He says, I may not be an anarchist, but when I see a worker in struggle against his natural enemy, policeman, I know whose side I'm on. So he's talking about a situation where he and his colleagues intervened in support of some anarchists who were engaged in a gun battle during the Barcelona May Days against the police. And again, it's this kind of thing of the fine points of political identification fall to the wayside in these very strained military moments where there's people pick sides, don't they, and fall on a certain side. I'll post a link to the text in the chat. Okay.
Something from this most recent piece of reading that we did that I wanted to hit on quickly is the at the beginning of the Myth of the Party section, he says, social revolutions are not made by parties. They occurred as a result of deep-seated historic forces and contradictions. And I think this is a pretty like you encounter this argument quite a lot, and I encounter this argument from Marxists even, but that I think are have adjusted to fit this critique or see it differently than the people he's critiquing. But this concept of revolutions as this very spontaneous outgrowth of people who are, mentally haven't been politicized into sort of like the bourgeois hierarchical political framework, is the way that he built sort of like a constellation between that sort of like idea of hierarchy in our mind, and also the spontaneity of revolutions, the smoking pot and skipping work, and like these pieces together, I really feel like it does start to grasp at something profound and also I think ecological in a way that Bookchin's later work didn't fully continue to develop and grasp, like the spontaneity of. Now I've heard Dan Chodakov, and I can't speak on everything that Bookchin wrote. I don't want to presume that I know everything, but the I know that Dan Chodakov talks about like spontaneity increasingly developing in nature, and sort of like social ecological ethics has this sort of concept of spontaneity in it to this day. But I really feel, and it reminds me sort of Rick Falk-Vignier's book Swarmwise, where he talks about something like called the three pirate rule in an organization, where any three pirates together can make a decision on behalf of the entire organization. So it's like sort of chaotic in a way, but it mostly actually works a lot better. It actually works a lot better than going through all the bureaucratic process. And so Rick Falk-Vignier really endorses this mode of organizing. And Dan Chodorkov is the co-founder of the Institute of Social Ecology with Murray Bookchin, and he's got a book that we could probably pull up. It's called Anthropology of Utopia. It's a collection of essays. I think he would touch on this issue. I've just actually seen him speak at the Social Ecology conference on this issue, so I didn't actually read the text that corresponds to it. But yeah, the constellation between eyebrows, man. Yeah, he also, there's the old photo of him with like a really big mustache as well. There's another photo of him on a motorcycle when he's young. Apparently they used to call him Danny Sunshine back in the 70s. I was told by someone who knows his niece or granddaughter or something like that. Yeah, so the constellation between slacking off, smoking weed, growing your hair out, the spontaneity of revolutions over the structure of a party, the way these things connect together, I really think there's an ecological narrative of spontaneity. And yeah, James just posted a picture of young Danny Sunshine in the. I think there's an ecological thing being grasped at here that I think needs further development, that I find really inspiring. And I just also happened to be thinking yesterday about the party form and how sort of like some doctrinaire Marxists that I've known have been very fixated on the party form, but we need a party, but also fuck electoral democracy. It just seems like a hilarious. Because obviously they're thinking of non-electoral parties, but in what sense is it a party at that point? Like the formation of, if I understand correctly, I think the formation of the party thing came out of the sort of commingling with electoralism and electoral parties. So like, what is a party anyways? Like what distinguishes a party from another type of political organization, other than like running in elections and having little buttons and stuff? It just seemed funny to me that the party language found its way into sort of doctrinaire Marxism when they could have called it anything, which just totally breaks with like the anti-electoral currents. But I'll hand off the speaking stick. I've just said 4 or 5 different random unrelated things that I stand by, but are whoever wants to pick it up.
So like I thought it was really beautiful, like and it kind of like affirms this sort of like realization that we're kind of wired to collaborate and cooperate with each other by virtue of the fact that we're social animals. But I don't know, in this story, like about these revolutions and this ultimately like what happened, there's also kind of like this terrifying realization that like power just has this way of sort of like consolidating. And it's just kind of like, how do you reconcile these two seemingly sort of like natural forces that just kind of like ebb, like or wired to cooperate, but how do you stop like those dickheads from just like taking control of everything just because it's convenient for them, and they tell themselves the right story that like, oh, it has to happen because blah, 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 blah. And it's just, I mean, that's not very articulate. I'm sorry, but I don't know. And just kind of like, yeah, just sort of like, just like the scary, like recounting of just like, oh, this bureaucracy and just like everything being co-opted and this thing that's naturally happening. Just now it's just sort of like being dominated. Like, yeah, that quote like really stood out to me. Like the Bolsheviks didn't like orchestrate it, the revolution. They dominated it. So I don't know. It's just kind of tough. It kind of got me thinking, like, what are things that like we can do, like revolutionary acts that we can do to sort of like materialize the world that, you know, we want to live in? I know, novel question, right? But like specifically like how to do so like in a really like authoritarian environment, or an environment that's like slipping like into authoritarianism. I don't know if anyone, this tiny tangent, I don't know if anyone here has seen the show Midnight Gospel on Netflix with Duncan Trussell, but they had this episode where they were talking to this guy that was like all about ceremonial magic, and just yeah, just this idea that like magic has to be this thing that like you work towards and like you live and embody, and like that's kind of like what creates like change in reality. Yeah, he's a good boy. I love him. So yeah, it's just like I don't know. It's just kind of like beautiful that like this is a thing that sort of happens, but it's also terrifying because it means that we're responsible for doing things, and it doesn't have to happen like now immediately, but it does mean like putting effort into doing things. And I really like this. Yeah, just another opportunity just to shamelessly thank you for putting us all together to like allow these ideas to happen. Let us juggle with them and play with it. I'm done.
Oh, sure. I'm being called upon in the chat to comment on the this like worker attitude, the like fucking off at work, etc. Yeah, I guess I'm just like curious to chat more about that. Like, I wonder if it is about this like undercurrent of resistance, like maybe the value of resistance. Yeah, I don't have like a lot to add to that. I'm just like curious to kind of get a chat going about it.
One thing that I could chip in on that front is that I think the sort of contradiction between worker organizing and like fucking off at work is actually not as sharp a contradiction as you might think, because we know like historically that work slowdowns is a type of fucking off at work. But if you do it in a coordinated sort of organized way, if everyone fucks off together, to use the words of Harrison in the chat, then you're able to achieve that you're able to achieve great things. Everyone spontaneously doing it by themselves sort of has benefits in a way too, in a way that it can be, it could even potentially be, say like spontaneously taken up by more people. But you know, there's stories I've read of like, you know, back where there was a certain like pace for working, and if the new guy shows up and starts working faster than everyone else, then someone pulls him aside and it's like, hey, listen, man, we make 5 car doors an hour here. You know, like this is like, you know, are you with us or are you with the boss? And he's like, all right, yeah, five an hour. No brown nosing allowed. No working yourself to death allowed. So I think that sort of collaborative culture can overlap a lot with the fuck off at rent or fuck off at work thing. So yeah, I think we'll pass off to James for the direct response.
Yeah, just on that, yeah, I mean, obviously, all these things like go slows, working to rule, etc., have been staples of the labour movement years. But what's interesting in the passage that we're talking about that Mwed's brought up is, I mean, Bookchin is talking even more narrowly here about quite an individualistic slacker lifestyle. So he makes it explicit in the quote, doesn't he? He says that you know, this revolutionary figure is someone who even turns against their own workmates, which again is like totally outside the spirit of workplace organizing. And I just wanted to add that it's super interesting. Like, this is something that Bob Black definitely picks Bookchin up on later, which is this is kind of exactly the sort of individualistic vision of what it means to resist that Bookchin himself attacks or appears to attack in Social Anarchism or Lifestyle Anarchism, The Unbridgeable Chasm. Obviously written 30 years later, but he turns you know, this it does feel a bit like old Bookchin attacking young Bookchin, or like old Bookchin forgetting what young Bookchin said about slackers who who can't be bothered to work or turn on their workmates or whatever.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there because reading this today is all pretty theoretical to me because I don't have like a good background on this topic. So yeah, for me reading it, I was kind of trying to draw connections to what's happening right now, and I guess just I wanted to comment on the sort of surge that we're starting to see of government and business pushing people to return back to normal, to return back to work. So I think there's like a lot of potential there to resist that push. And there was a really good article. Of course, I forget the author now, but they're calling this moment the Great Pause. I can find it and put it in the chat. But yeah, I think it's an interesting time to think about refusing to work.
Something that comes to mind about the current sort of like COVID-19 crisis with people working from home and stuff like that is that I'm sure, I mean, obviously there's probably a climate impact from people working from home, but also I think there's sort of a work slowdown happening in a lot of sectors of the economy. And it's sort of like the I don't know, I saw someone on Twitter say something like, you're like you're either working from home on a salary or a frontlines worker on minimum wage right now, and the sort of thought of like salaried professionals are able to do a sort of like work slowdown from home during the crisis under this sort of like big tent of everyone being like, whoa, COVID's scary. Like we can all do less and we're going to let each other off a little bit. And we're all like, there's I don't know, that connection just came to mind. But I'll hand it off to Harrison.
So I can only speak to this regarding directly like the people I know very, personally. And the situation may be different for other people, but a lot of people that I know have been finding, including people who work on salaries. Like my best friend is a salaried lab worker, works in bioscience. They're finding that because of this work from home situation, in order for bosses to keep their personal narcissism and their hours up in order to feel useful, the bosses are constantly like calling for meetings almost every day. And because they're constantly calling for meetings almost every day, in those meetings they're coming up with more and more tasks for their workers to do at home that they wouldn't normally have had to do. And so my friend who my best friend who is the bioscientist is finding herself working from home till 10 p.m. at night, because in addition to the work that they've had to do already, they also have to do all this extra work and all these extra meetings that their boss feels they need to put on them in order to feel like they actually contribute anything ever. So I don't know, I've seen that in this situation a lot of people are having to actually do far more work, arbitrary work specifically, because of this situation. And I think maybe those things that are being highlighted in this situation that a lot of people are being like sort of woken up to, but I think there's maybe the potential for like this anger to not really be harnessed if we just assume it's going to be like a positive thing. I don't know. I think there's something that we need to consciously figure out how to deal with.
Yeah, not to any really like extreme extent with me personally, but I mean it reminds me of a little bit like I've had a whole lot of, questionably necessary meetings with other school staff and stuff. So I mean I know what you're talking about. I was thinking something similar about how we turn this situation like really like political and I guess deliberate to make it something that has the kinds of effects that we want. Like, how do we make these work slowdowns not just feel like, well, what? I mean, I guess it's just the coronavirus and everything will get back to normal or whatever. How does it become maybe kind of revolutionary-ish? It feels like, I guess I worry that, like you were saying, H, it kind of, it might just, there's a risk of it being just kind of like, I guess, incidental and not turning political, right?
Oh man, Shy, you gotta eat some food. You need it to fuel your brain magic. It's a vital reagent.
Yeah, I just typed in the chat that I ran out of confidence because I didn't eat lunch. But I think this has been a great chat so far, and I wish that we could talk more, but maybe we can just go through with some closing sort of thoughts for anything that people want to mention. What I will also just say again for the people listening is that the Library Socialist Book Club, we do readings on Thursday at 20 GMT. And then the following Wednesday, we have a discussion group, which is at 7 GMT and 23 GMT. So you're going to have to check what time zone that looks like for you. But we wanted to have a universal time because we do have people participating all over the world. You can check out the podcast that this grew out of at seriouslywrong.com, SRSLYWRONG.com. And if you want to join the book club and you're not a patron of the podcast, you can shoot us a message and we'll give you a link to join the server. We don't want money to be a barrier for people to participate in this sort of thing. Both the discussion groups, which are off the record, just private conversations and Discord channels, and these reading groups, these reading streams where we bring out the information. So we can bring it down the line, maybe starting here at the top. And if anyone has final things they want to say before we say goodbye to our friends at home.
I just wanted to thank everyone for another fantastic stream. It's been really great fun. And I think my favorite sort of the two favorite like complementary lighthearted take homes I've got from this were the Bookchin quote about the workers who grow long or longish hair and fuck off their jobs, coupled with the picture of a young Dan Chodakov that looks exactly like the person that Bookchin is describing in that passage. I think that's a great dovetail of two multimedia things. I really enjoyed that. So thanks for flagging that up. Sure. Picture.
He might have literally been thinking about Dan, just based on that photo.
Yeah, I mean it's uncanny, It's like to be honest, I guess a lot of people in the '60s and '70s looked a lot like that. It was emblematic of a whole generation, I suppose, of that culture. But yeah, still funny to think.
I can imagine at the time looking at that sort of like the hippie movements, countercultural movements, and saying, I think as Bookchin sort of did, like these are people who are shedding their place in society and have the potential to shed their place in society and become revolutionaries. And that many of them are shedding their place in society and becoming part of this revolutionary class. And when he draws that distinction between sort of like these class distinctions versus a sort of like a universal political a political class that people can join by measure of shedding their social position and becoming part of it. I can imagine how in that time that narrative could also seem particularly strong, where you just see the flourishing of this big middle finger to all the society that you've seen your whole life in a vibrant way that's just unexpected and just it contains things you would never guess. And Bookchin was over the age of 40 at the time of writing this.
Yeah. I'm going to choose to walk away from all of this with a feeling of hopefulness because I'm insane. But, I also think that I also really like that shedding as a great verb for kind of what has to happen. I think we have to challenge a lot of our preconceptions, and we also have to kind of, remember that a lot of people have a lot more years of indoctrination and propaganda to get through. And I think the most effective way that we can get through that is through curiosity and compassion. Because when you have people riled up and pissed off, the parts of their brain that are responsible for empathy and connection and reason, like they just don't work. It's just not possible. So, people are really only able to talk about these ideas when they're relaxed. So if you have people that you're stuck at home with that you fundamentally disagree with, that might be a helpful thing. There's definitely times and places to talk about ideas that are going to be more effective. And yeah, if you have to deal with a ton of people living with that you just radically disagree with, I hope that you can find safety here and speak your mind. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Closing remarks, since we're wrapping things up. I just think, yeah, exactly what people were talking about. Just the optimism that Bookchin shows here in regards to counterculture as opposed to economic class is something that I think is very interesting, especially in relation to not even his necessarily really later stuff, but even in the 80s, he wrote something specifically about this, Were We Wrong, about, the mistake that the 60s were going to start a revolution based on this voluntary counterculture class unrelated to economic means and relations of, production. I just think it's really interesting to see all of these almost, and with the idea of betraying your fellow worker at the thing rather than organizing with them to slack off together, is something that I think later on he pretty, obviously he disagrees, but I think he disagreed pretty consciously. I think he went back and admitted that he was wrong in that instance, and maybe he went a little bit too far in the other direction potentially, but I think looking at that like mid stuff, that stuff in the 80s, is when he kind of acknowledged maybe potentially.
Yeah, thanks everyone. That was fun, and I'm looking forward to talking about the first half of this essay.
This has been another reading from the Post-Scarcity Anarchism book for the Library Socialist Book Club. We are your readers, trans rights, and we are here to read a little bit every week on Thursdays. And if you want to join us, join the book club. Anyone who's in the book club can feel free to hop on and just hop on a little before we start at 1 p.m. PST on Thursday. If you're on a little before we start, we can bring you through how we sort of manage it on the back end. We're happy to have new people joining. Love the variety of voices and perspectives. And it's something that I think we all really, really enjoy doing. Also the discussion groups on Wednesday, depending on where you live in the world, one of the meetings might be on Tuesday night or Thursday during the day because, hey, we live in a crazy world with time zones. But that's it. It's a good thing because it means that the duck graph problem of solar energy can be solved just through long distance transportation of of energy. But yeah, okay, so this has been the first half of Listen Marxist, and the next half of Listen Marxist will be next week. This has been a joy, and really, really great. I'm very happy. Thanks for listening, and hopefully we'll talk to you on Wednesday, and we break out into groups and talk about this stuff in more detail. See you then.